She was trying not to cry in the middle of a five-star ballroom when he first saw her. Han Sung-jun didn't look at women, not like that, but something about the way. She held her chin up while her ex-boyfriend laughed at her, with another woman on his arm made him set down his champagne glass. He had toppled empires. He had buried rivals, but nothing had prepared him for the quiet devastation of one woman's dignity refusing to break. Welcome to Lou Stories. Now buckle up. If you're new here, welcome to Lou Stories, where we tell the kind of stories that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit subscribe and keep that notification bell on, because the next one is already coming. Now, let's get into it. 4 years. That was how long Rita had given Marcus everything. Her loyalty, her patience, her savings, her softest and most unguarded parts. 4 years of being the kind of woman who remembered how he took his coffee, who stayed up past midnight when he was stressed at work, who shaped her schedule quietly around his moods and swallowed her own needs so he would never feel their weight. She had loved him the way certain women love, completely, and without performance, without keeping score. It was real. That was the part that made it so difficult to survive. She had spent the entire afternoon of their anniversary preparing the dinner. Candles placed at careful intervals across the table. His favorite lamb chops, marinating since morning in garlic and rosemary. A bottle of deep red wine she had stretched her budget for because it was the kind he had mentioned once in passing at a restaurant they could barely afford back when things were still tender between them. She had even put on the blue dress, the one he had said years ago made her look like she belonged in a painting. She had wanted the evening to feel like a beginning, a recommitment, a reminder that 4 years of choosing each other meant something that endured. Marcus walked through the door at 7:43 p.m. and didn't notice any of it. "We need to talk," he said, and the particular flatness in his voice made the candlelight feel almost unkind. He delivered the news with the composed efficiency of a man who had been rehearsing it for days. He had met someone, Bianca, 24 years old. She made him feel alive in ways he hadn't felt in years. He actually used that word, alive, as though he had located something new and impressive, and Rita was the old thing he was setting down to reach for it. He wanted to pursue his happiness. He hoped she could understand it wasn't personal. He said all of it in the tone he used for work calls, measured and slightly detached, like she was a contract. He was politely dissolving rather than a woman who had spent 4 years building a life in the direction of him. Rita didn't scream. She didn't sweep the candles from the table or throw the wine. She stood very still in the blue dress while the lamb chops went cold, and she listened until he ran out of words. Then she said quietly, with complete and final certainty, "Get out." He looked almost startled. She could see it, the slight recalibration of a man who had expected tears, pleading, negotiation. The whole speech had been calibrated for that response. The careful softness of it, the way he had framed her pain as something he deeply regretted, but simply could not be responsible for. He had expected her to beg. She gave him nothing but the door. She cried for 3 weeks after he left, not loudly, not in front of anyone. In the shower, in her car, at red lights, in the single-stall bathroom at work where no one could hear. She cried the way women cry when they realize that the love they gave was entirely real, even when the person who received it was not. She cried for the stayed-up nights, the stretched budget, the version of herself that had believed loyalty was enough to make someone stay. She cried until the grief started, slowly and reluctantly, to dry out. 3 weeks later, her colleague Priya stood in her doorway and refused to leave without her. There was a charity event, The Meridian Foundation Gala. One of those high-profile evenings where the city's wealthiest moved through gilded rooms and wrote checks large enough to ease their consciences before returning to their regular lives. Rita had no real business being there. She was an interior designer at a mid-tier firm, not someone who moved in those circles. But Priya said she needed to be seen, needed to remember that she still had somewhere to be. Rita wore a gown the color of deep midnight plum, velvet that fell across her curves with quiet authority, tracing the generous lines of her body that Marcus had once described dismissively as too much. She wore it anyway. She walked into the gala with her shoulders back and her chin level, carrying a champagne glass. She intended to hold more than drink. She lasted 40 minutes before she saw them. Marcus and Bianca, positioned near the champagne display as though they had been placed there by design. Bianca's laughter was loud and deliberate, the kind engineered to carry. Her gown left nothing to imagination. Her hand was looped through Marcus's arm with the specific confidence of a woman who believes she has won something worth winning. Marcus saw Rita. He smiled, not warmly. The particular smile of a man who wants you to notice what he has upgraded to. He walked over. Bianca followed. "Rita," he said smoothly, "I didn't expect to see you here. You look good." Bianca scanned Rita from head to toe with eyes trained for the purpose of diminishing. "She looks like she's trying very hard," she said, smiling the whole time. The guests around them continued their conversations, completely unbothered. No one saw it, but Rita felt every word, the surgical precision of being made small by the person who had once promised to protect her. "I was just getting some air," Rita said evenly. "You always made everything so heavy," Marcus added almost fondly, which was its own kind of cruelty. "Bianca's different. She's easy. She doesn't need everything to mean something." He laughed. Bianca laughed. The sound landed exactly where it was meant to. Rita turned to leave and walked directly into a man, not a wall, a man, broad-shouldered and completely still, wearing a suit that had clearly been made for exactly one body and no other. He was Korean, sharply handsome in the way of something dangerous. High cheekbones, a jaw that could have been carved, eyes the color of deep water that gave nothing away and took everything in. He was holding a champagne glass that had not spilled, despite the collision. That detail alone told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man who did not rattle. "I'm so sorry," Rita said. Han Sung-jun looked at her, not past her, not through her, at her, with the full and deliberate attention of a man who had just decided in the space of one moment that she was worth seeing. "Don't be," he said. His voice was low, controlled, accented but precise, like everything else about him. Behind her, Bianca said something, and Marcus laughed. Han's gaze moved barely perceptibly over Rita's shoulder and returned. "Friends of yours?" he asked. "No," she said. "Not anymore." A pause that held more than silence. Then, "Walk with me." Not quite a question, but offered somehow as an exit. She followed him, perhaps because the alternative was standing near Marcus. Perhaps because the stillness of this stranger felt in some unreasonable part of her like something solid to stand next to. They moved toward the quieter end of the ballroom, where the chandeliers were warmer and the noise softened. He lifted a fresh glass of champagne from a passing tray without asking if she wanted one, as though her wanting it was already obvious. "You held yourself well back there," he said. "Most people don't. You were watching. I noticed things. No apology in it." She turned the glass slowly in her hands. "It wasn't composure. I just didn't want to give them anything to use." Something shifted in his expression, barely visible, like a current beneath perfectly still water. "That," he said quietly, "is exactly what composure is." Rita almost laughed. She hadn't laughed in 3 weeks. Han Sung-jun, he said, and extended his hand. She knew the name. Everyone in certain rooms knew the name. Han Group, 12 countries. The kind of man whose name appeared on buildings more often than it appeared in interviews, deliberately, carefully removed from the public's soft reach. "Rita," she said, and took his hand. His grip was firm and warm, and he held it one beat longer than occasion required. "You're in design," he said. She blinked. "How did you know?" "You've been evaluating the ceiling installation since you walked it in." "Not admiring, assessing." He said it plainly, without drama. She had been. She hadn't realized it showed. "Interior architecture," she said. "Mostly commercial." He nodded once. The way men nod when something confirms a decision they've already quietly made. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a card, matte black, embossed silver lettering. He set it on the ledge beside her glass, rather than placing it in her hand, as though leaving the choice entirely to her. "I have a project in Seoul, a private residential penthouse that 3 separate designers have failed to understand." A measured pause. "If you're interested." Then he inclined his head once faintly formal and moved back into the crowd, unhurried, not looking back, as though the conversation had been precisely as long as it needed to be, and not one breath more. Rita stood there for a long moment. The card sat beside her glass, his name pressed into black paper like a quiet command. Across the room, she felt Marcus watching her. She picked up the card, the following. Morning, she stood at her kitchen counter, staring at the card while her coffee went cold beside it. Han Sung-jun. She had looked him up the night before, against her better judgment, and then against it a second time. Korean-American magnate, founder of the Han Group, real estate, technology, and what several investigative pieces described in carefully imprecise language as private security consulting. There were photographs of him at state functions across 3 countries, a controlled Wikipedia entry, and almost no personal information offered to the public. No relationships named, no soft edges visible. Just a name attached to a scale of influence that most people never got close enough to feel. She set her phone down and looked at her bank statement instead. Marcus had drained joint savings account in the 3 weeks between deciding to leave and actually walking out the door. She had been too destroyed to notice until the statement arrived like a final insult. The apartment she had paid the majority of rent on for 4 years. The renovation investment she had co-funded with him, entangled in enough legal ambiguity that her share would take months to extract if it ever fully came back. She added the numbers twice. Then she stopped because the math was the least painful part. She needed money. She needed a reason to get on a plane. She needed, more than anything, to stop waking up in the same city that remembered every single thing. She called the number on the card. The voice that answered was professional and efficient. She was transferred to a scheduling assistant within minutes, who confirmed that Mr. Han had already reviewed her portfolio prior to the gala, which she filed away, because it meant he had not approached her by accident. An NDA arrived in her inbox within the hour. The call the following afternoon lasted 11 minutes. Han was not warm on the phone. He was exact. A private residential penthouse in the Hanam district of Seoul. Complete interior redesign. He wanted something that felt like controlled power rather than sterile wealth. 3 previous designers had delivered sterile wealth, and he was done with it. He had reviewed her portfolio and found it, in his precise phrasing, sufficient. Then he named the compensation figure, and Rita sat down slowly in the middle of her kitchen floor without entirely meaning to. "When would I need to start?" she asked. "Next week," he said. If you're prepared. She looked around the apartment. The unburned candle stubs still on the table. The blue dress still hanging on the back of the closet door. The city outside the window going on without her permission. I'm prepared, she said. Seoul arrived like a fever the body adjusts to after the first hard day. The city was enormous and lit. Glass towers catching the winter light at angles that made the skyline feel almost aggressive. Streets layered with motion and the smell of street food and concrete ambition. Han's assistant, a precise young woman named Ji Yeon, met Rita at Incheon and delivered her to a serviced apartment in Hanam so immaculately lighted it bordered on comedy. Wide windows that swallowed the entire skyline. A bathroom larger than her old bedroom. A card on the kitchen counter, simple and deliberate. Monday, 9 a.m. Address below, signed with one initial, H. Rita stood at the window in the dark and watched Seoul breathe below her. Something in her chest, the knotted, compressed thing she had been carrying for weeks, had not healed. But it had shifted. It had made just enough room. Monday. She arrived 7 minutes early. Han was already there. He was different in his own space, and she noticed it immediately. The suit was gone. A dark sweater, clean and well-fitted, nothing that softened his presence, but somehow made it more immediate, less armored. He walked her through the penthouse without ceremony, pointing out structural issues, describing what the previous designers had gotten wrong in the same tone he probably used in boardrooms. He didn't offer tea. He didn't perform warmth. She interrupted him gently. What do you want it to feel like? He stopped walking, looked at her, and after a moment said, plainly, I want it to feel like someone actually lives here. It was the most human sentence she had heard from him. She opened her notebook and got to work. The weeks that followed were a kind of accidental closeness. The kind that builds not through grand gestures, but through small, accumulating details. She was there every morning. He appeared unpredictably, sometimes at 9 with 2 cups of coffee from the place across the street, which he had selected without asking how she took hers, because he had apparently already noticed. Sometimes in the evenings, settling onto the bare concrete floor beside her sample boards, and saying, very little while, she talked through layouts aloud, offering no input, and somehow being the most useful kind of presence anyway. The kind that doesn't require performance. He asked questions, rarely, carefully deployed, as though he was rationing something he didn't want to spend too quickly, where she had grown up, what she had wanted to be before design found her, whether she missed home, wherever home felt like for her right now. She answered more than she intended to. One afternoon, a business contact of Han's arrived to discuss a separate matter. A man named Park, loud and aggressively charming, with the particular confidence of someone who had never been genuinely corrected. He noticed Rita within 2 minutes, complimented her figure twice, offered dinner, suggested she was wasted on construction work, which told her everything she needed to know about him. She redirected him with practiced efficiency and turned back to her sample wall. But she noticed, from across the room, the exact moment Han Sungjun set down his phone. He crossed the space without hurrying, but he crossed it and positioned himself between Rita and Park with a calm naturalness that required no raised voice and left absolutely no room for misunderstanding. Rita is the contracted lead on this project, he said. Perfectly level, perfectly final. Her work requires concentration. Let's keep our matters separate. Park blinked, then laughed the way men do when they've been corrected by someone they cannot argue with. Of course, of course. After he left, Han returned to his documents without comment. Rita looked at him for a long moment. You didn't have to do that. He was using up your focus, Han said, without looking up. She turned back to her samples, but something warm had settled low in her chest. The kind of thing that arrives without announcement and does not leave easily. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap like and drop your thoughts below. Now, back to the story. She noticed, over the days that followed, small things she was not supposed to notice. The way he stood closer to her than strictly necessary when they reviewed her progress together. The way he remembered, without being told, that she didn't like overhead fluorescent lighting and had the building's electrician install warmer fixtures before she arrived one morning. The way his eyes tracked her whenever someone new entered the space. She told herself it was professional. She told herself she was rebuilding, not starting something new. She told herself this particular time, in this particular country, with this particular man, would remain clean and bounded and professional. She was becoming aware, slowly, that she was not going to succeed at that. The danger arrived on a Tuesday evening, without warning, the way real danger always does. She was leaving the penthouse building at dusk, her portfolio bag on her shoulder, her mind still running calculations on a structural problem she hadn't resolved, when the black van slowed alongside her on the narrow side street. It happened in seconds. A door, hands, darkness, the sound of the city swallowed. She was inside before she fully understood it as real. They weren't rough, which oddly made it worse. There were no weapons visible, no threats spoken. Just a clean room, well lit, water on a table, and a silence that communicated everything without needing words. She was leverage, a signal being sent to a man who had spent years accumulating influence powerful enough to make enemies who operated this way. Schotten. She didn't know that Han had been notified within minutes of her disappearance. She didn't know the particular quality of stillness that came over him in that moment. Not panic, not fear, but something colder and more absolute. She didn't know that he had made 3 calls in under 4 minutes and set in motion a series of events that dissolved every obstacle between him and her location. With the efficiency of a man who had built his entire empire on the understanding that leverage was a two-way instrument, he reached her in under 4 hours. When the door opened and he was standing there, tie gone, jacket loose, something raw and undone moving behind his eyes that his face was never supposed to show. She burst into tears before he crossed the room. He covered the distance in seconds and gathered her into his arms without a word. He held her completely, jaw tight, one hand pressed to the back of her head, his whole body a wall between her and everything outside it, and let her shake. "I've got you," he said against her hair. Quiet, absolute, "I've got you." She held on with both hands. Later, much later, back at the service department with his security stationed at the door, the city dark and indifferent below. The space between them collapsed in the way it had been collapsing for weeks. Only now there was nothing left to stop it. He checked her wrists, where the restraints had been, running his thumb carefully across each one. He didn't let go of her hand afterward. She looked up at him in the low light of the room and saw in his face something that had clearly been there for a long time and had simply run out of places to hide. Something open, undefended, nothing like the man she had nearly collided with in a ballroom weeks ago. He said her name like it was something he had been holding without permission. The rest of that night belongs to them. She left before he woke up, not because she didn't want to stay, because she was terrified of what she would find in his eyes when he opened them. The careful, polite withdrawal, the professional distance reassembling itself, the kind conversation about what things needed to remain. She had been left before. She knew the specific, humiliating geography of that experience. She could not survive it again. Not from him. Not after everything the last several weeks had rearranged inside her. She packed quietly, booked the first flight home she could find, left a note on the kitchen counter, just her name and a thank you, the most cowardly reduction of everything she actually felt, and was in a car to Incheon before sunrise. He called at 6:22 a.m. She watched his name on the screen and let it ring. He called again at 6:47. At 7:04, she turned her phone off. She told herself it was the right thing, that this was how it had to end. Clean, professional, no complications that neither of them needed. She told herself this on the flight home. She told herself this unpacking her suitcase in her apartment, standing in the same room where the candles had burned down and Marcus had delivered his careful speech. She was very committed to telling herself this, and she was becoming aware, in the quiet of the apartment, that she did not believe any of it. She threw herself into the work instead, finalized the penthouse design, prepared the complete presentation package, material specifications, sourcing documents, contractor recommendations, everything meticulous and thorough. She sent it with a formal email. Professional, contained. She was good at this. She had been good at containing herself her entire life. 2 days after sending it, her doorbell rang. She opened the door. Han Sung-jun was standing in her hallway in a dark overcoat, slightly undone around the edges in a way she had never once seen from him. No tie, jaw set tight, eyes that had clearly not slept in the way that isn't restfulness but resolve. He had flown 11 hours. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of stillness that comes from someone who has made a decision and traveled directly toward it. You ran, he said, Han. You ran, he said again, quieter the second time. I need to understand why. She looked at him for a long moment. She had prepared for this, or told herself she had. Because I know how this ends, she said. Her voice held. Barely. You go back to being exactly who you are, and I go back to being someone you once hired. And I couldn't stand there, waiting for you to look at me like I was a mistake. She pressed her lips together. I have been left before. I know what that looks like when it starts. I wasn't going to wait for it. He was very still for a moment, the kind of still that in him was not absence but volume. Then he stepped forward, and she stepped back, and he kept closing the distance until there was nowhere left to go, and he was close enough that she could read his face completely, something in it open and unguarded, and nothing at all, like the man she had first met in a ballroom. I flew 11 hours, he said, low and steady, in the middle of restructuring a $9 billion merger to stand in your hallway. He let that land. You are not a mistake. You are the opposite of every mistake I have ever made. You are the only thing I have been entirely certain of in longer than I can tell you. Rita's eyes burned. I don't know how to be easy, she said. I don't want easy, he said. I have had easy. I am choosing you, specifically, on purpose. She closed the distance. He met her halfway. The city, naturally, did not stand still while Rita's life rearranged itself around something new. Word traveled the way it always does in the orbits of people who pay attention. Rita had been seen in Seoul. Her name had been attached, through photographs and professional publications, to one of the most talked-about interior projects in the Hanam district that year. She had been promoted at her firm on the strength of it. And somewhere across town, Marcus, who had followed Bianca into a lifestyle that could not sustain the weight of his particular character, was paying attention. Bianca had left him. Rita heard it through mutual friends first, then through the particular silence that falls around a man who has finally experienced what he spent years handing out. Marcus had been seen alone at several events. He had texted Rita twice, Messages she had read, processed, and chosen not to answer. Not with cruelty, with completion. There was nothing in her, when she read those messages, except the quiet understanding that she had no anger left for him, because she had used all of it building something better. The Meridian Foundation Gala returned, as it did every year, and Rita attended, on Han's arm, in white, simple and devastating. They had been there 20 minutes when Marcus's kit appeared in her peripheral vision. He looked composed on the surface. He had always been good at surfaces, but there was something hollow around his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. He made his way through the crowd with the directness of a man who had rehearsed this. "Rita," he said. She turned to face him. Han stood beside her, perfectly still, not looking at Marcus at all. He was looking at Rita, which was, she had come to understand, more formidable than any stare-down could have been. "You look incredible," Marcus said. Something raw moved through his voice. She recognized it. The sound of a person realizing too late the precise value of what they discarded. "I've been thinking about reaching out for a while. I made a mistake. I know that now. I handled everything wrong, and if there were any way to—" "Marcus," she said gently but without softness. "Don't." He glanced at Han. Han met his eyes with the expression of a man who has already won and finds the entire situation mildly tedious. "You moved on fast," Marcus said. "The edge in it was mostly pain." "I didn't move on fast," Rita said. "I was ready. I just needed someone worth being ready for." It landed the way truth lands. She watched it land in his face. And then she looked away. Not dramatically, not with satisfaction, but with the complete and genuine disinterest of a woman who has stopped needing anything from a particular person. Marcus stood there a moment longer, then he left. 2 months later, Bianca called. Not to fight, she was past that. And anyway, there was nothing left to fight over. She called to say that Marcus had been seeing someone else the entire time he was with her, that she had figured it out weeks after he left, that she was sorry for the ballroom. Her voice was younger than Rita remembered, stripped of the armor, quieter, something real moving underneath. "He does that," Rita said. "He finds where people are softest and he uses it. That's not about you." Bianca was quiet for a moment. "I just wanted you to know that I was wrong about you." "I know," Rita said. "Thank you for calling." She hung up and went back to the kitchen, where Han was standing over the stove with a concentrated expression, attempting to follow the handwritten recipe she had given him for her grandmother's pepper stew. He had insisted he could learn to make it if she wrote it down clearly enough. She had written it very clearly. He had still managed to make it halfway before it started to threaten him. She leaned in the doorway and watched him frown at the page. "You're running it too hot," she said. "The page says this temperature. The page is slightly optimistic. Turn it down." He turned it down, then looked over his shoulder at her, and it was there. The expression she had come to understand was the real one. Not the boardroom face, not the ballroom stillness. Just him, the version he had decided she was allowed to know completely. "I have a question," he said. "Okay." He reached into the cabinet above the stove, which was a theatrical choice she would tease him about for years, and set a small black velvet box on the counter between them. It sat there between the recipe and the stew like a very serious punctuation mark. "I'm not asking because it's the logical progression," he said. His voice was steady, but not its usual kind of steady. This was the steady of something honest rather than controlled. "I'm asking because every morning I already know exactly where I want to be, and it is wherever you are. And I would like that arrangement to be made permanent." Rita looked at the box, then at him, then at the stew, which was going to need rescuing in approximately 30 seconds. "Save the stew first," she said. He stared at her. Then yes, she said, obviously yes. He saved the stew. He slid the ring onto her finger. A simple, extraordinary thing, exactly like him, she cried, which she would deny doing for the next several years. And he held her the way he always held her, completely, without reservation, like she was the most irreplaceable thing in the room. 6 months after that, in the Hanum penthouse she had designed for him, for them, as it had turned out, Rita stood at the floor-to-soiling window in the early morning, watching Seoul light itself from the east. Han came up behind her, put his arms around her, and rested his chin against her temple. She had been carrying the information for 4 days, turning it over, carefully, privately, the way you turn over something that changes everything. She reached for his hands where they rested at her waist and guided them, deliberately and gently, lower. He went completely still. Then he exhaled, one long, slow breath, and pressed his forehead to the side of hers. "Rita," he said. "I know," she said. He turned her around to face him, and what was in his expression then was nothing the world was ever allowed to see. Not the empire, not the composure, not the carefully maintained distance. Just him, open, bright, entirely undone by a woman who had walked into him in a ballroom and refused, even then, to let herself fall apart. "Good," he said, his voice rough at the edges. "That is very good." She laughed. He kissed her. The city glittered below them, indifferent as cities always are. But the room she had built for them, without knowing she was building it for them, felt exactly the way she had wanted it to feel from the first moment he told her what he needed. Like someone actually lived there. Like someone had finally, completely chosen to stay. You made it to the end. That means you are truly part of the Lu Stories community. Thank you for your support. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments. I will be replying as always, and stay subscribed because the next story is already waiting for you.